Hey gang, this is your video for section 11.1, and chapter 11 talks about cell communication. If you guys have gone through the reading guide already, it states at the beginning of the reading guide, this chapter is not actually the hardest of all the chapters, but it's things that you probably haven't dealt with at all before in any of your previous classes, a whole lot of new terminology, and so it ends up being difficult just because there's so much new terminology that this book, as soon as it introduces a word, it assumes that you know what that word is. So anyway, we're going to kind of buzz through the different sections here. 11.1 is just an overview, and it starts out just by saying, hey, matter of fact, cells communicate with each other, and especially in a larger organism like ourselves, if there's going to be everything working together for the common good of the larger body, there has to be a lot of communication happening between cells so that everything that needs to get done can get done efficiently and at the right timing and all those kinds of things. So there's a lot of that communication happens. So right off the bat, the book is basically just saying, hey, communication does happen. They give this example of yeast cells. This was one of the early studies on how communication happens between different cells, and so they have yeast cells can reproduce sexually, where they transfer genetic material and join genetic material, and so here they have them labeled two different strains of yeast, an A and an alpha yeast. So the A and alpha, and essentially what happens is an A and an alpha, when they are ready to mate, they produce proteins, little molecules that they excrete, and so the alpha yeast cell will produce what they call alpha factors, and the A yeast cell will produce these A factors, and they basically exchange these chemical signals. When they do that, if the A cell receives an alpha factor from the alpha cell, then it'll trigger something inside of the yeast cell to change its shape. The same thing happens with the alpha cell. It starts to change its shape, and if these two things are right beside each other, the cells will actually fuse together. They'll join their cell membranes together and become one cell with the genetic material from both parent cells, and that's actually a huge development in cells to be able to join genetic material. Anyway, but this all happens because they need to tell each other they're there to start. If they're going to mate with each other, there needs to be a way for one to tell the other, hey, I'm here, and that one to say, hey, I'm here too, and then they can actually join each other. So just an example. This chapter then is going to get into the details of, like, what is this signal that is sent from one to the next. And so first we're gonna take a look at different ways cells can communicate with each other before we figure out how the entire signaling pathway works, and how they respond to the signals. But how can they tell each other that they're there, or send signals to each other? One way that we find cells can communicate with each other, one of them is obvious. Earlier on in the year, we had learned that cells that are right beside each other in both plant and animal cells, these cells have the ability to make what they call gap junctions, but basically little gaps in their cell membranes that can allow particles from one cell to freely flow to a cell beside them, and that would be the easiest way for two to communicate, if they're right beside each other, actually touching each other, and they can share parts of their cytoplasm. Then one cell can be doing something, and the cell right beside it knows what's happening immediately. Okay, so that's one way that we call this direct contact. It's one form of direct contact on these cells that are stuck beside each other. Another form where cells can actually touch each other is cells that are mobile, or cells that are able to move around the organism. An example being like our immune system cells, our white blood cells. They are patrolling through our lymph system as well as our blood, and they are able to travel, and anytime they bump into something, they are able to recognize that thing or not recognize it. Okay, and what this is showing is a cell recognizing another cell based on proteins on the surfaces of the cells. And that is a common form of communication, especially in our immune system. where we are able to identify bacteria and identify that it's no good, and if we can do that, if that communication can happen, then the cell, the white blood cell, will actually launch an entire immune response through that. So these are two examples of direct contact communication. If it's not going to be direct contact communication that's happening, then we have to get to signaling systems, and this is what we're going to spend the majority of the chapter on. But when we have one cell that is releasing a signal that is going to travel some distance and then be picked up by another cell, that signal will be picked up and responded to by another cell. So we have something that they call local signaling here, and that is, again, two cells that are very close to each other. Maybe they are touching, maybe they're not touching, but they're very close to each other, and then they're sending signals, chemical signals to each other to cause responses in the other cells. So the two examples they have here, one of them, as you were reading through the book, talked about growth factors. And that's actually a really interesting one. Like if you get a cut in your skin, the skin cells near the cut, they will actually send out different growth factors. Those growth factors will tell cells in that area, that very localized area, hey, you better start growing and dividing. And so it's one of your body's ways of healing is by saying, hey, if there's something broken, then cells close to the break are going to send out signals that will say, let's start growing and let's start dividing, and then we can start the healing process. So that's one of them, and that's what's shown with this paracrine signaling that they're showing here. And then the other one is in your nerve cells. Two nerve cells that are right beside each other. One nerve has to stimulate the nerve right beside that, and there's actually always a gap between the two nerves. And you'll get into that, I think, a little bit later next semester with Mr. Steiner. But there's a gap between the two nerves, and so chemicals leave one nerve and are picked up by the next nerve and cause changes in the second of the cells in response to what the first cell was telling it. So those are local signaling, cells that are very close to each other. Maybe they aren't touching, but they are at least in the same region. Then the other type of signaling that we have is long-distance signaling, and the most common of these would be hormones. Hormones would be produced in one part of the body and then carried by the blood throughout the entire body. And if they hit cells that recognize whatever the signal is being sent, then they will do something about that. Okay, so one of the examples on this one, the hormone testosterone, one of the things that happens is as males increase testosterone production once they hit puberty, and the testosterone is made in the testes, that hits the bloodstream, goes throughout the entire body, and it's sending a signal to all kinds of different cells to do all kinds of different things. So muscle cells will start to develop in response to this signal of testosterone. Hair follicles all over the body will start to increase hair production. So all of a sudden guys start getting facial hair, their legs and arms start to get a little bit more hairy, maybe chest hair, back hair, all kinds of, anyway, guys, disgusting and hairy. But anyway, that's all the signal that's sent from one location in the body, and it's traveling throughout the entire body, doing different things to different parts of the body. And anyway, that's long distance signaling, where something's hitting the bloodstream and going from there. So the majority of the chapter here is going to be not just that signaling exists and how do signals get from one cell to another, which is what we've talked about. It's going to be more, once these signals are received by a cell, how does that cell respond to it? Like, how does it cause the cell to respond? In those yeast cells, how did it cause a yeast cell to start changing its shape, actually, so that it could end up fusing with the other cell? And so we find that, first of all, every single signaling pathway is different. So what the book's going to do, we're going to take you through a whole lot of different examples of more common systems, okay? Although, again, every single one is going to be slightly different than the other. So we're going to learn some principles, basically. But the one thing that we find in most cases, there's basically 3 steps that are happening. The first step here in this overview is that we're going to receive the signal from another cell. They call that reception, but the signal from another place is going to hit a cell and be recognized. Here's a receptor protein that's going to receive the signal. Okay, that's the first step, receive the signal. Second step is we've got to get that signal inside the cell and passed to the place where action needs to happen. Okay, so we call that transduction, and it's just usually it's a series of molecules that are going to take the signal from the outside of the cell or from wherever the reception happened to the location of where the cell actually has to respond. Maybe it's in the nucleus, maybe it's somewhere else. Okay, but so they call that transduction. It's usually called a signal transduction pathway. Is something you're going to hear a lot, or you're going to be reading a lot about. And then finally, you get the response. Okay, so after we've received the signal, then we carry that signal through the cell to where action needs to happen. Then the actual action that happens is the response. Okay, so the sections coming up, basically we have a section for the reception part, a section for transduction, and a section for response. They get pretty heavy on lingo and vocabulary, but the concepts are very simple. If you can just keep this in mind: reception, receive the signal; transduction, pass it along; and then response, actually do something with the signal that came. So that's it for section 1 here. This was the overview section. This was a piece of cake. We'll get to the more intense things here in the next video.